7Artisans 50mm f1.8 for the Nikon Z system. Keep in mind they did send me this to try out and make the video on. I do have the official 50mm f1.8s to compare this lens to. The 7Artisans lens is a bit taller than the Nikon Z 50mm f1.8s, though it is slightly thinner. Both lenses have an autofocus manual switch on there. In this case, the one on the 7Artisans lens is got less travel to it, and it's not as difficult to push. If you are moving the lens around, you might rub the lens and accidentally change that switch. The lens has a manual focus ring. It takes quite a bit of force to adjust. The lens has a clickless aperture on there, however it is electronic, and when you adjust it to a specific aperture in the camera, it's going to be a set number. If you want to adjust things through the camera, set the lens to A. The 7Artisans lens has a metal mount, and it has a USB-C port integrated into the mount itself, so if you need to update firmware at some point, that will be available. Both lenses have a 62mm filter thread on there. It's an easy to find size, so that's very nice. With the kit lens, you can see an obvious difference in build quality compared to the two other lenses. It's got a plastic mount. The 7Artisan lens does not have a rubber gasket on the back of the lens like the official Nikon Z 50mm f1.8s does, so keep that in mind if you care about weather resistance. Both lenses come with a click-on lens hood. The Nikon lens hood is a little bit larger, basically equalizing the size difference in the length of the two lenses. I did take the 50mm lens from 7Artisans out to a beautiful garden to take photos, walk around, and went through the aperture ranges quite a bit, so you can see the differences there with the 50mm at different apertures in a outdoor situation. Zooming in at f1.8, see that has a little bit of color fringing in this specific situation, but otherwise a good amount of detail to the photo at 100%. I was moving around side by side, taking a few photos at different apertures, f1.8, f5.6, and f8. There is some color fringing on the foreground in f1.8, and it does get a lot better at f2.8. Here's another one at f1.8, f5.6, and f8. Zooming in past 100%, you can see a difference between f1.8, 5.6, and f8 with the 7Artisan lens, but I would say the 1.8 result is definitely sufficient at 100%, or just like a standard amount that you would export the image by. I did do some test photos outdoors, trying to see what I could get with flare sun stars. At f1.8, there is some color fringing. You can see on the edge of this building. Obviously, you have to stop down the lens to get sun stars in this case. As I go through the range, you can see there is some reflections of the elements in the lens, and it does start to sharpen up as we decrease the size of the aperture. In this case, you can get that double line effect to the sun stars. Not sure if that's unique, but it does look pretty cool. There are some situations you're going to have lower contrast with this lens. As I zoom into the image, still get a lot of detail, but just keep in mind in some situations might look a little bit hazy, and it could also be somewhat related to my raw processing software. And obviously you can increase the contrast, increase the vibrance, the saturation in post-processing. There is some color fringing with this lens, as I mentioned before, and obviously depending on the situation you will notice it. In this case, there's a blue-red on the edges. As we zoom in, this is f1.8, definitely noticeable in this case. Here again, f1.8, there is some fringing. You see the red edges to these leaves. Here's another example. As I go through the aperture range, you can look at these edges. There is some green. Around f2.8, it's much less noticeable. Found a good spot to check out background quality. Outdoors, in this case, you can see the background point source lights, what they look like at f1.8, and I can also zoom in to the place where I had focus. f1.8, f2.8, f5.6, f8, f11, and f16. You can get a lot of detail from this lens. f2.8 in this case, very nice look at these flowers up close. Looks good. I did do a number of tests with the 7Artisan lens, the Nikon 50mm f1.8s, and also the Nikon kit lens at 50mm. But in that case, f6.3 was the largest aperture. Lenses look extremely similar at f1.8 in the center. When it is center focused, looking at the quality of the background point source lights, again, no surprise, they look pretty similar. I think the 7Artisan lens might have a little bit less detail in those point source lights than the Nikon lens. As we zoom in, it's hard to tell. I'm not sure, but yeah, you can decide for yourself in that case. At each aperture, I did another test, in this case focusing on the side of the image. It appears that the Nikon lens does have a bit more detail on the side when you're focusing over there. There was a bit more fringing on the 7Artisans lens on the side. The handle looks more in focus on the 7Artisans lens compared to the Nikon lens. That means there's a good chance focus was a bit off compared to the two lenses when I did this test. The two lenses at f2.8 focused in the center. It's hard for me to tell. Both of them have a good amount of detail. I don't really see any difference in color fringing or any other aspects of the lens. Looking at the bokeh, the lens is starting to stop down its aperture, but still they look very similar between the two lenses. At f2.8 focused on the side, you can see the settings are the same between the two different lenses, 1/60th of a second, ISO 50, f2.8, but it looks like the Nikon lens is brighter. That basically means that there is less vignetting with the Nikon lens compared to the 7Artisan lens. Both still have a decent amount of detail, but the Nikon lens does have a bit more. There is also a bit of purple fringing on the 7Artisan lens in the side. Focused in the center of the image at f6.3, I'm able to include the kit lens. Let's zoom in. 7Artisan lens on the far left. In the center we have the kit lens, and on the right is the Nikon Z 50mm f1.8s. It's difficult to tell much of a difference, but I would say that the Nikon kit lens does have lower image quality compared to the two prime lenses at f6.3. In the center. Again, it's not a massive amount, but it is noticeable. Some of the lines, some of the little bits of dust and such aren't as defined. I would say that the kit lens also has pretty strong background point source lights, less appealing to look at, in my opinion. Focusing on the side at f6.3 with 3 different lenses. Let's zoom in. In this case, if you go for either of the prime lenses, you will get an optical benefit at f6.3, which is the maximum aperture of that kit lens at 50mm. Vignetting is probably very similar between the three at that aperture. Last test in the center at f8 between the 3 different lenses. It's so difficult to tell any difference. You really have to zoom in to unrealistic levels to notice anything. See little specks of dust that do correspond to each lens. In this case, some of the little specks of dust zoomed in really far on the kit lens aren't as noticeable or barely noticeable on that lens compared to the 2 prime lenses. And looking at the background point source lights between 3 lenses, when focused in the center, you can see what that looks like. I think there's another situation where the kit lens is suffering here in the quality of the backgrounds compared to the 2 different prime lenses at f8. When you really zoom in there, you can see that the edges of the kit lens background point source lights are more defined, which for the backgrounds, that's not really something you want. Focusing on the side of the image at f8 with the 3 different lenses, let's zoom in. It looks like the 7Artisan lens has a little bit more vignetting compared to the other 2 lenses. Optically, assuming my focus was perfect between the 3, which who knows, probably not the case, but they do look pretty comparable with the amount of detail at f8 on the side of the image. I do think the kit lens has a little bit less detail than the 2 prime lenses, so if you do want to upgrade from your kit lens, there's a good chance you will get a nice little improvement in optical quality. I also did a few self-portraits. 50mm is a relatively decent focal length for portraits. Obviously not ideal. Probably want something longer like an 85mm, but with the 50, it'll work out just fine. And with the large f1.8 maximum aperture, you do get a nice benefit for portraits. Looking at the images fixed to the size of the screen, side by side, they look comparable. Don't really notice any differences there. And in this case, I was using aperture priorities, so the settings might be a little bit different. I will say it seemed like the 7Artisan lens focused more accurately more often compared to the Nikon Z50mm f1.8s. Whether that was Z5 or some other factor involved or just coincidence, I'm not sure. At f1.8, zoomed into the eye where the focus point was, you can see that the focus was slightly off, slightly different between the 2 different lenses. With the Nikon lens, it's more focused on the eyebrow, and with the 7Artisan lens, it's more focused on the eye itself. So in those situations, focusing on the eye itself is what you want, what you're going for, and it does visibly make a difference. I would say they're very close optically, and if the Nikon lens had focused right on the eye, it would have looked very similar, but it didn't, so it looks a little bit worse. At f2.8, I was able to get more accurate focus between the 2 different lenses. Zooming in, they look extremely similar, so I think you'd be fine with either lens doing portraits. I was also able to include the kit lens at f6.3 with this portrait photo. See the differences? Let's zoom in a bit here. Again, at 6.3, you're not going to notice much of a difference. unless you really zoom in. If you're doing portraits at f6.3 in a studio situation or whatever, I think it'll be fine with any of the lenses, but it is nice to have the versatility of the larger apertures if you want that. In this case, we're hitting different ISO values, so there isn't really a big point in zooming in too far, but optically they all look pretty decent at 6.3 for this specific use case. The 7Artisan lens compared to the 50mm f1.8s and the kit lens from Nikon, which one might work best for you really depends on your needs and how much money you want to spend. If you want the best optical quality on the sides of the image, maybe consider the official lens, but it is pretty comparable with the 7Artisan lens. The kit lens itself, if you just have that and you want to upgrade something, you'll probably see a nice difference between either prime lens throughout the image. And in the center of the image with a lens like this, a 50, that's probably where you're going to be focusing a lot around that area. These are pretty comparable. I don't really notice much of a difference, but I do notice a difference between the 7Artisan lens and the kit lens, or the official 50 and the kit lens. With a kit lens, you get that zoom, but you don't get the optical quality throughout the range. And at 50mm, you're at f6.3, so you're very limited at 50mm when you zoom on that kit lens. But with the 50, obviously you have that nice large aperture range. These two lenses compared mechanically, they both have nice build quality. With the 7Artisan lens, it does have that aperture ring. If you want that direct control on the lens itself, it isn't clicked, so it's a smooth aperture ring, but it's electronic, and it just basically lets you adjust the settings through the lens instead of through the dials on the camera. There is a USB-C connection point to update firmware if you ever need to with the 7Artisan lens. Overall, the 7Artisan lens is surprisingly comparable to the 50mm f1.8s optically, and build quality wise, they seem pretty decent. So it's going to be up to what you want to spend, what you want to do with these lenses. Again, keep in mind that 7Artisan sent me this lens to try out and make the video on based on my collaboration terms. Scout Trophy Banzai, thanks.